Welcome to Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, where we talk about gospel insights through great stories and help you find entertainment that is both true and beautiful. I'm your host, Liz Busby. I'm a writer of science fiction and fantasy, a reviewer of books, and a Latter-day Saint. And with me today is my co-host, Carl.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carl Cranny. I have a PhD in religion, and I enjoy talking about the intersection of religious themes in pop culture.
And Carl's also getting over COVID, so we're going to excuse his voice quality today. He's
I
doing the best he
apologize.
can. And then we have two guests with us today. Nathaniel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. My name is Nathaniel Givens. I write about religion, science, politics, and a bunch of other stuff for a lot of venues, mostly Public Square magazine recently, and also I'll be in the forthcoming Radiant from Faith Matters. And my first book, Into the Headwinds, co-authored with my father, Terrell, is coming out from Erdman's on October 18th. So excited about that.
That's awesome. And then our second guest is Barrett. Would you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So my name's Barrett Bergen. I am a film writer and director and producer. I've done a number of short films and most recently a feature film. I love to explore kind of psychological thrillers, science fiction genre, but also I have a proclivity for putting Latter-day Saint themes and ideas in my work. And then on top of that, I have written quite a bit about Latter-day Saint cinema, both its history and what its potential future could look like. And I like to kind of blend all things, mythological, religious lore with, sci-fi, high concept, futurist ideals, and sort of I'm interested in the mesh of those two things.
And so Barrett's skills are going to come in handy because today we are talking about Stranger Things, the hit Netflix nostalgic 1980s horror series created by the Duffer Brothers. Specifically, we're going to be discussing season 4, which was released this summer in 2 parts with 9 total episodes. There will be spoilers for the series as a whole, so if you haven't watched it yet, you may want to catch up before listening. But first, our best books segment, where we each recommend one thing that we are watching, reading, or listening to. And my recommendation today is a podcast that I recently discovered called Overdue. It is a podcast about the books that you should have read already. So every episode, the two hosts take a book that is a classic or a book that everyone's talking about right now, and one of them reads it and explains it to the other one who has not read it. And they're very funny and personable, and they deal with a lot of also the history around the book and its reputation. So it's a great way to pretend like you've read more books than you have, which smart people are always looking to do because we don't have enough time to read everything. So I've really enjoyed it. I've listened to a couple from books that I have read just to see how they approach those. And now I'm embarking on a bunch of books that I should have read already. So highly recommended. Carl, what have you got for us today?
So I finally, having watched the sci-fi / Amazon Prime series, The Expanse, decided to pick those books up and start reading them. And I have a couple of weirdly idiosyncratic complaints about the series, but as a whole, I have been really enjoying them, and I have burned through them a lot faster. When I got COVID a couple weeks ago, actually, I read about 2 of the books in a period of about 4 days, and because I had nothing else to do, couldn't quite sleep, couldn't quite do anything else, was just super tired, and they were the perfect amount of intellectually engaging yet not super duper serious that I enjoyed quite a bit, and I find all the characters fun. I think the science fiction is interesting. The intersection of those two themes is kind of where my complaints come, but more on that after I finish the series. I started book 5 a couple days ago. So, The Expanse, the series, I would actually recommend the Amazon Prime series as well, but the books have been quite fun in ways that a TV show, of course, could never match up to. So, The Expanse, either the TV show, I suppose, but mostly in this case, the books is my recommendation this episode.
Hey, Carl, quick question. Are you also reading the tie-in novellas and short stories?
I've read a couple of them, but
Okay,
not.
because some of those are really good as well.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'll make sure to pick up the rest of them. I've I read a
They
couple
have a
of them.
collection out now. You can get like
Oh,
all of them in one collection.
nice. Well, I will look to see if my library has that then. Thank you, Nathaniel.
And for those who don't know, there's also some good Mormon references in there with the spaceship Nauvoo. So another fun tie-in. Nathaniel, what have you got for us today?
So I've been reading a really cool series. The first book in the series is called "In Another World, I Must Defeat the Demon King." This is a genre I've never read before. It's called lit RPG. For those who don't know, it is basically a mashup of fantasy and like role playing mechanics. It's written by a friend, Miles English, so I have to admit I'm a little bit biased. But the first book just came out April 19th. The second one is In Another World, I Must Train My Dungeon. That came out on August 11th. He just announced the third one is coming out. So they're coming out really quick. These are really fun, kind of light reads. I like them because there's a lot of funny action, a lot of really interesting world building, and I really like the ensemble cast where they're written from the perspective of the different main characters. So each chapter is a different perspective, kind of rotating through about four main characters, and they have really fun, quirky, warm relationships. So that makes them a lot of fun for me.
I keep hearing about books in this genre, so I guess I have to try one of them pretty soon. So I know
I
what's
would
going
try
on.
this one. The genre as a whole has a mixed reputation, I would say. But yeah, if you want an introduction to the genre just as a whole, there's Sword Art Online is an anime that was on Netflix. I think that's one of the most famous or well-known representations of the genre. But you should really just read these books.
Okay.
I wonder if I've accidentally written a lit RPG book because one of my Dungeons and Dragons campaigns we've been playing for about 12 years, and it's basically a group novel writing exercise because we do it all by wiki. And then when I'm the dungeon master, and when we finish a post, I will write it up as if it were a novel, and then ask for their reactions. And when I discovered this genre that existed, I discovered
Well,
it's
here's
like,
the thing: do you actually put the stats, like the actual numbers, in the narrative?
no, but
That's
we
what
have
makes
like,
it a lit RPG. Like
okay,
they
so
actually
it's
talk about like I
Interesting.
leveled up. I have 10 points to add to like my attributes, and like so all those mechanics of a role playing game are actually embedded in the story.
So I guess
Oh,
mine would be
interesting.
like half lit RPG then, because that definitely informs everything that happens. But on the wiki itself, we have what we call the gray box, where we post like the sort of meta question stuff, and then I write it up as a novel, and we move on. So it's a, I don't know. I haven't read any of it, which is why maybe I'll take your recommendation as well. But I think I accidentally stumbled into this about 12 years ago, sort of. Anyway, so it's a it's an intriguing genre that I look forward to reading something in at some point.
There you go. All right, and finally, Barrett, what have you got?
I think I'll actually share what I'm reading right now, which is a fantastic screenwriting book. And even though I'm a filmmaker and it's specifically for me as a screenwriter, I actually highly recommend this to any creative person or storytelling. It's John Yorke's Into the Woods, a 5-act journey into story. And what I love that he does in this screenwriting book is instead of kind of just delineating, oh, by page such and such, you want to do this, or the inciting incident, or breaking down acts. The very first thing that Yorke does is launch into how he actually proposes that there's kind of almost an intuitive shape to story that everyone knows, and that's across mediums, right? Across plays, across books, the oldest kind of religious theater of the ancients, of the Greeks. And that it's interesting that like an 8-year-old can somehow intuitively just come up with a story that actually kind of follows the rules and the shapes. And so while he teaches all of these different tactics and techniques and whatnot, what he's really trying to get at is understanding the intuitive, like the nature of story. Like what is story, and if something doesn't work as a story, is it still story, and kind of platonic in that way, right? The form of a story. And I found it really, really interesting, as he's kind of taking the best gems of all of these different structures and story ideas, not unlike Joseph Campbell in a way, but instead of saying this happens, this happens, this happens, it's more of it's kind of retroactively understanding that. So it's like, this is what story is and why, therefore you can try this or you can apply this. Very, very good read, very interesting read, that I'd recommend to anyone.
Ooh, I'm definitely going to have to pick that one up. I'm always looking to level up my storytelling.
Does it
So let's,
sound to
yeah.
you like, sorry, would you say then that part of his thesis is almost that storytelling has like Jungian archetypes that we all just
Yes.
sort of tap into?
Yeah,
That's an
he
interesting
even kind of
thesis.
cites Jung. It's like, that's why story works. It's not, story doesn't inform psychology. Psychology informs story, and that's why it has a shape. Like the human brain has certain patterns and certain things that or he even kind of suggests, and I suppose we would maybe agree as Latter-day Saints, that there's a spiritual dimension to story. There's a reason that certain stories work and certain stories do not, and it's because that's like literally the laws of physics nature of story itself.
How interesting.
It is, it's good, it's really, really informative.
Interesting. So now we're gonna break into our main discussion talking about Stranger Things. Stranger Things was a hard sell for me at the beginning. I resisted watching it. My husband watched the whole first season without me and talked me into it after season 2 came out. He's like, "Oh, you'll really like this." I am not someone who enjoys horror very much. Um, and so I don't know if I'm very qualified to talk about the question of, is horror a moral genre? But that's kind of where I wanted to start. Why do we like horror? Is it okay to watch horror? What is the psychological impulse, if you will, that makes us want to watch and read horror stories?
So I have an interesting story that I think will help set the stage in maybe a sad slash humorous way. We'll see how this goes. My dad was the bishop of a freshman ward for a number of years at BYU. And one year he had a lovely Muslim kid who lived in the dorms at Deseret Towers there with all the other students. And for Halloween, a bunch of these Mormon kids took this Muslim to a haunted corn maze. And it was a terribly traumatizing experience for him, and he kind of came back thinking we were all secretly Satan worshippers. And it was just this really interesting clash of cultures and expectations and things that you do for fun. Because this kid did not enjoy being chased through the corn maze by a guy with a hockey mask wielding a fake chainsaw, while the rest of the Latter-day Saint kids seemed to really enjoy that. And so it's made me sort of thinking about this story, confront the idea of why do we like horror? Why do we enjoy being scared? And to me, having just taught this principle to my children in the pool, a little bit scary, a little bit fun. A lot scary, a lot fun. With the idea that I jumped off a high dive a couple weeks ago and bruised my tailbone, actually. But it was fun. And getting exciting yourself is something, having those emotions can give you a kind of emotional high. But that being said, the kind of horror that I specifically enjoy is the more cerebral stuff. Just like a slasher flick would be like the equivalent of just running through a corn maze getting chased by a guy with a fake chainsaw. But there's like subgenres of horror, and two that I have seen the last couple of years that I really enjoyed were It Follows, which is kind of approaching horror, the that deals with sort of the issues of STDs, because you can pass this monster from one person to another, and the other was The Babadook, which is a meditation on grief and loss through the lens of this monster that appears in this woman and her child's life. But they were more than just like freaking you out, getting you these emotional experiences, and so I really enjoy those. But if you just want to watch Nightmare on Elm Street, I don't know if I'm going to join you for that. So, as a genre, you got to break it down into its constituent subgenres, and that's where I think a more fruitful discussion exists.
There's a term, Carl, for that subgenre, especially as it's been rising in kind of the past 5 to 7 years, maybe the past decade. It's called elevated horror. It's when the horror the horror is approaching something more real and more substantive, and the art is kind of enhanced rather than just like a slasher flick, you know.
Sure, sure. So yeah, so I like elevated horror then apparently. So
There you
good to
go.
know that terminology.
Impressive that you can make horror sound elitist. Well done. I was just going to say briefly, I'm kind of in Liz's boat here. I don't think I ever would have watched Stranger Things if it had been sold to me as horror. I have no interest in horror. Although, as I was thinking about this question, there's probably a lot that I read and watch that technically is horror. I just didn't get into it for that reason and don't really look at it through that lens. So for Stranger Things, I'm in it for, the story and the characters. And if a lot of scary stuff or grisly stuff happens along the way, that's just the setting. And I'm not saying it's not horror at all. I'm not qualified to judge. I'm just saying that's not how I approached it. One of my favorite series is the Dresden Files, which is urban fantasy, I think, but probably parts of it could also definitely qualify as horror now that I think about it. That's just not how I approach it. When I think of horror, I'm thinking of the slasher movies. And personally, I don't really see the point. And I don't want to be judgmental, but if the question is it moral? I've always thought that horror was kind of an amoral genre, and that's part of why I don't like it. Now, people process stories in different ways, so just because it comes across as amoral to me doesn't mean I'm telling other people not to watch it. But for me, and I have seen a couple. I've seen like The Ring, The Grudge, which are not slasher, but are horror, just because I kind of wanted to see what the fuss was all about. And I thought they were well done, but they especially just struck me as like lacking a moral core. And when I see evil depicted on screen, I want to fight it, and I need a character who's going to fight it on my behalf. They don't have to be successful, and they don't have to be perfect, but like that's what I'm looking for is the reaction to evil. That's not just defensive and not just I want to survive, but like this is evil. I'm going to oppose it for good. Like that's what I'm looking for as part of any story, pretty much. And it seems like horror kind of lacks that, and it's just like, oh no, someone's trying to kill me, survive, and I don't know. Just for me, it's never been appealing.
I love and appreciate Nathaniel's perspective on this. I can see why you'd feel that way. Mine's kind of antithetical, actually, in some ways, but I completely understand why you would share what you did. For me, horror is a moral genre, and not only moral, but actually quite productive. I think that, and it can be gratuitous and silly and extra violent, but I think that ever since cavemen have told each other scary stories about, I don't know, the monster on the mountain that actually kind of keeps the kids from running off and getting eaten by bears, there's some real use to the extremity and the frightening nature of horror as almost morality tales, as like metaphors, right? If you look at the Grimm fairy tales or even Hans Christian Andersen, while they've evolved kind of for our modern sensibility, at least in their original forms, these are quite grotesque and dark stories that ultimately have a didactic and kind of moralizing but useful point to the society. And so for me, is horror a moral genre? That's so broad a question, in that there are so many ways to approach horror, that just like any other genre can either be, kind of gratuitous and over the top and pointless and sort of reveling in the disgusting kind of violent nature of it. And then there are elevated ways, or there are productive ways in some of the more classic or well-told horror films that kind of get at something true. And to me, also effectively stimulate the emotion of fear, which can be a productive and useful emotion. I think as Latter-day Saints, we even it's interesting because when we're dealing with films and movies and things depicted on screen, our approach kind of changes and evolves. But even if you look at the scriptures, there are pretty graphic, sometimes chilling, startling descriptions and passages and things. And then, of course, there's the beauty and there's the uplifting and there's the hopeful and there's the redemptive. But it has its place, I think. I think if somebody, something that we learned while I was at BYU in the media arts and department, and Orson Scott Card talks a little bit about this in his fantastic essay, The Problem of Evil in Fiction, which just gets down to why
Such a good essay.
yes, why evil's depicted ever. I think you need a healthy media diet. Just like feeling fear as an emotion all the time, or anxiety, for example, is not healthy or productive for your brain and for your mental health. I think if your media diet subsists only of just the most macabre and dark, then that is unhealthy and bad for you. But I do think that there's room and productive engagement with really strong, powerful horror films that are also pretty demanding and terrifying. My most recent experience with this was finally venturing into seeing The Exorcist, which I had been warned away from for so many years, and even with sort of my broader approach to ratings and genre, and trying to uh, decide on each piece with the help of the Spirit and through study and prayer, I guess you would say, by looking up what each piece is about. I had put off The Exorcist, and once I finally watched it, I found it strikingly spiritual. I found it incredibly moving and informative. And so I don't know, but to each their own, I suppose. But it's interesting. I think there's a lot of moral value in horror.
I really appreciate that you brought that perspective here. To those of us who are not big horror fans, there's, again, got to bring in my guy, C.S. Lewis. He has a quote that says basically that let detective stories be judged by those who like detective stories, and let sci-fi be judged by those who like sci-fi. So similarly, it's important that we get the perspective of people who love horror before we just say, I don't like horror, therefore it is a bad genre. Um, because things that we don't like, we often can't see the gradations, differences between the slasher fic and something that has a message that's trying to say something about good and evil,
Well, it's a
which
fair
is
analysis. I
useful.
mean, it's a trickier one, I think, to engage with. And of course, I would have filmmaker friends that would say, "No, I love the slashers. I get something from that." And of course, then you have to interrogate. With anything, it's like, well, does loving a genre, or does loving something give it moral or ethical value or spiritual value? No, not necessarily. So it's hard it's hard to say.
It
Um,
requires discernment, would you
that's right.
say?
Exactly. That's right.
I mean,
So
I think it
bringing,
also
yeah, go
it
ahead.
goes back to the one thing I was saying, which is that fiction isn't like just the text; it's how it interacts with the audience.
Yes.
I really like screamo. That's a genre of music for those of you who might not know. The kind where you're yelling and screaming. I really like that, and I actually like my favorite band is a religious screamo band. I could easily see people who would just be totally turned off just by the sound, and they would not be able to get anything out of it. But I listen to it. I love the lyrics. The band is Thrice. That's my favorite band. So I'm sensitive to like, yeah, I'm trying to express like horror to me isn't really working, but I really don't mean that as a judgment that it wouldn't work for anybody else. I'm not just being non-judgmental. I genuinely think other people could watch it and have a different experience than I'm having. So I
Very
do
sure.
respect that.
It's a
Well,
great
this
comparison.
is this is interesting now because we're discussing the horror as a genre, and I think we need to ask the question now: is Stranger Things horror, or is it something else with horror elements? Because that's where you start to get into this like question of genre and what was the term? No,
Elevated horror.
Oh, elevated horror. Yeah.
elevated horror
Elevated.
versus slasher flicks, right? And so The Exorcist turned out to be, kind of spiritually profound for you in a way that E.T., which freaked me out when I watched it as a child, maybe
Everyone.
did right, yeah, maybe did not. But is E.T. a horror movie?
No, ET
No.
Not just
definitely is
because it
not.
freaked us out.
No.
That's a good point. And so I think kind of the reason I introduced this question was because I had heard from a lot of people who were on that edge, enjoyed the first three seasons of Stranger Things, and then just like bounced off season four because of the the increased horror of this season. Like it's definitely more graphic, more visceral, more like ugh.
I mean, I've
I don't
also
know
had
the
friends
words for
say
that.
that I'm not getting as much out of it as they are because I haven't seen the canon of horror films. And so
Yeah,
I've had friends that are like, "Oh, there's so many homages and callbacks," and like they're going over my head. I don't see any of them. So yeah, I mean, I think season four. I'm going to say that season four is horror, and I
it
enjoyed it.
is.
I like season four. But yeah, if the horror fans say it's horror, then I'm not going to argue.
Stranger Things is. I just looked it up. Not that anybody need. We can come up with our own kind of genres here. But I was curious what does Stranger Things consider its genre, its main
Itself.
genre? I've actually looked at their pitch packet before, and it is sort of pitch. The original first season, which I would say the first season and the fourth season are especially closer to horror. The fourth one for sure is. But it's
Mhm.
science fiction horror drama, so it's like kind of this mystery. It's this blend. It's maybe not pure horror, but it's horror mixed with mystery thriller. Kind of
And lots of supernatural elements.
supernatural. Yeah.
Mhm.
Just a
To
large dose of
me,
80s nostalgia.
And a
yeah,
large dose of 80s nostalgia,
80s
indeed.
horror. Yeah.
How do you guys feel about the 80s nostalgia? Because I don't know about you, like I was born in the 80s, but I was not conscious until the 90s. So some of that is I it seems self-indulgent to me who doesn't have the nostalgia for some of the things, but a lot of people seem to love
Season 3 was out of control.
it.
It
It
was
was a bit.
like calm down, and they brought it back, and I thought it worked okay. I was glad that season 4, I was actually really excited at the end of the first episode of season 4 when it got way dark. I was like, oh, like, okay, they're back, they're trying stuff again, whereas that scared everyone away. I was like, finally we're away from the bubblegum colors, and like just because the first season was so tight and so like carefully and purposely executed, and did have more of an adult kind of horror tone. It's funny when people are saying that about season 4 because it is darker, but season 1 balanced really scary stuff perfectly with nostalgia and kind of this 80s flavor, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I have the same impression Liz does again. Like, I was born in the 80s, but I was in high school in the 90s. And so, like, that's my cultural anchor. But there is this sense that the 80s are nostalgic to everybody. It doesn't matter if you remember them or not. It's become the decade of nostalgia. And, like, I have some geopolitical theories about why that's the case. The end of the
I
Cold
definitely want to
War.
hear that.
Well, you had the USSR and you had USA, and that made it easy to kind of make sense of the world. It creates a simplistic story, probably especially for people who didn't live through it. Because if you were actually worried about the atomic war, then you're not going to look back on this with nostalgia. But for everybody who's, we've grown up in a world defined by 9/11, war on terror, which is extremely confusing, very conflicting. Everything seems chaotic and is falling apart, and it's really hard to have an easy narrative for the world, and especially for America's place in the world. But when you look back at the 1980s, it's like everybody feels like that was the period where America made sense. um, and if you go further back, then you get to the 60s and 70s, and that's also confusing.
And
Very.
then there's World War II, which I feel like that's why all the historical fiction novels are always in World War II, because it's very easy morally to be like, well, this was obviously right, this was obviously wrong, and it makes it easy.
But it's too far back for pop culture references. So
Exactly. Nobody remembers them.
otherwise we could hearken to it, but we can't. And so that's like another one of my favorite music genres is synthwave. And
Mm,
synthwave it has a very 80s
yes.
aesthetic. I never
Yeah.
listened to 80s music. Like I have no idea what bands they're copying. What I like is the Midnight and Gunship and a whole bunch of other. They're all like
Yes.
contemporary bands, and I recognize that this is. I feel nostalgic listening to it. Like it's supposed to be nostalgic. I feel nostalgic, but it's weird that like I feel nostalgic without the reference. Like I don't know the original bands this is based on. I probably heard some of the hits, but like it doesn't matter. Like 80s are code for nostalgia, and synthesizers are also now code for nostalgia, and anybody can kind of tap into this nostalgic feeling even though you didn't live through it, and even though you don't like I don't really get a lot of the 80s references in Stranger Things, but like being with your friends and playing Dungeons and Dragons and having like a game that you play with your friends be all consuming so that it takes your entire day and nothing matters, and like, you haven't started to like girls yet, like everybody can anchor to that. And so I think 80s has just become like a language that taps into a much more universal nostalgia. And it works for me. I like it.
We need a word in English, and there probably is one in German, for nostalgia for an area or a time period that you yourself didn't live through. Like,
Well, we
Well,
call it nostalgia.
nostalgia.
what's what's funny to Nathaniel's point is, in my opinion, synthwave, which I love too, does not even actually sound like 80s music. It sounds like its own thing. It sounds like what we want 80s to sound like, in the same way that
Right.
to some extent Stranger Things is probably not as reflective of the 80s as it is of our view of this nostalgic 80s. When you go look up an old video or pictures from the 80s, it's like, oh, it's not that different, but this kind of enshrined, you know everything's neon and synthy and fun and big hair and all of that stuff.
I had this pointed out to me when I was doing the reviews of Under the Banner of Heaven. But the interesting thing about setting a show in a historical time period is that in actuality, everybody's not going to have all stuff from the 80s, because the way you live your life is you have inherited stuff from the 70s, from your older cousins, and from the 60s. So like the slick look of everything is very 80s in Stranger Things is artificial, right? It is more 80s than the 80s.
And I think there might be a little bit of a dark side to all this nostalgia as well. I mean, I've been hearing stories, and I haven't done a bunch of follow up research, that more and more of the Spotify listening share is going to older bands. And it's kind of like, now that we have everything digitized, and you don't have to compile a library, like it's all there. It's harder and harder for kind of new music to compete with what has already withstood the test of time. And there's a sense in which this nostalgia might
Mm.
actually be kind of strangling the present, because it's
Hmm.
so easy to tap into something that everybody knows is good. We have it in the highest quality. It's readily available, and so these old songs and old bands from people that might not be alive or might not be making music anymore. Like, how tough is it if you have to compete with the best of
With the
4 or 5
Beatles or whatever.
decades, right? Yeah, like that's tough. And you didn't have that before you had the internet and before you had streaming services, because music just didn't have that long of a practical shelf life. And so every generation kind of had to make up its own music and only had to compete kind of with, it was like you had everything broken down into like, weight rankings for boxing or something, right? And now the weight rankings have gone away, and it doesn't matter if you step into the ring and you're 140 pounds, you're going to be going up against somebody who's 250 pounds. Sorry, tough luck. Everybody's in the same ring. And so, yeah, I kind of worry about that just a little bit.
Hmm.
That's an interesting point. With regard to Stranger Things, though, so there's a hefty dose of 80s nostalgia. There's a hefty dose of 80s nostalgia, but one of the things that I like about it is that it's a good remix of a lot of things. We've talked about horror, we've talked about the 80s, um, but I find the characters interesting, the world building with the Upside Down and sort of what's going on with that, which they finally explained some of this season, and I was really happy to see that, because it's just kind of been this thing's like, oh, there's this parallel universe and you can kind of access it. We're not quite sure how. Um, uh,
They
and
definitely
so
caught up the world building a bit
They
in this one.
retconned it.
right,
Yes.
well, yeah,
Well, they
yeah,
literally have gone back and changed things, like George Lucas, right? They said if
right.
you go back and watch, they've changed some things to make it fit this where the story went.
Wait, really?
So not yes.
I hadn't
Yeah,
Hmm.
heard that at all.
This is
yeah.
like a
Oh,
thing they've been subtly doing without advertising it.
They
So now, like,
changed.
oh,
we have to all go back and watch.
Yeah, they
The,
changed
yeah, the
somebody's
birthday.
birthday, and they
Hmm.
they they changed a scene um, where what's his name? Nancy's one of Nancy's boyfriends, not Steve. The other one is spying on them. They re-edited that scene because they didn't like how creepy it felt, and they're going back
oh,
and
That
interesting.
was
fixing
super
Stranger
creepy.
Things as we're watching it now. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, and I
Actually,
haven't
Oh,
watched the first ones enough to go back and like notice the difference, unfortunately. But it's an interesting approach.
that's a whole other issue. We could even I'd like we could do a whole podcast on sort of the
Retconning,
the
yes.
revisit, yeah, retconning, revisiting, changing things. I hated it when George Lucas did it, but actually that's not true. There were a couple points where I was like, okay, it was improved by having that there, but that was like 10% of it. how interesting that they've been changing it or retconning it. Or I even liked that, like they in season 1 when Barb dies to the Demogorgon, and every like the you could tell the Duffer Brothers were not expecting the fan reaction to be
Yeah.
like, oh, poor Barb. And so they deliberately put in season 2 sort of the hashtag justice for Barb storyline to give the fans some service because of this thing that they didn't expect to show up, or at least not to have the impact that it did. And so it's interesting. I didn't realize they'd gone back and changed stuff, though. That's
Well, it's
really interesting.
interesting. That's the way that now, like, we are interacting with the media as it's being created, and the audience has a lot more impact on it now because of the voice we are given through social media and the internet. Whereas, you're producing television in the 90s, and you might hear that there are, executives or film reviewers who don't like a particular thing, but you're not going to hear about the general consensus of your audience as often. I mean, I guess you can do studies, you can do your test audiences, but it's not the same.
So definitely a crowdsourcing aspect to social media now that,
To
for
all
good or ill,
creation.
yeah.
I was actually just listening to Dan Wells and Brandon Sanderson talk about that this week. They talked about how authors have started changing things in books in response to the way the fans theorize about stuff. It's getting so much more interactive. It's interesting.
I don't like it.
No?
No, in season 4, part of what I didn't like is I felt like they were getting preemptively fan servicey, and it was just a little too precious. The way they introduced new characters is a little too. It felt like a marketing campaign at some point. I can't really put my finger on it, but I was just like, "Oh, here's the character that is supposed to be the new fan favorite," and it was so overt. It didn't feel earned, and I was not a fan of that.
Now, which character are you talking about? Because there's
What's
one that
his
I liked
face?
and
The
one that I did
metalhead.
not like. Yeah, Eddie.
I like Eddie. I'm not complaining about Eddie, but it was just and the actor. I'm sorry, I don't remember any. I don't know anybody's name. The actor did a great job. I love Eddie, but just some of the storyline, it was just a little too in your face. It was a little too. Here's going to be the new fan favorite. And I don't know, it just felt it took me out of the world a little bit because like it felt like they had shoehorned part of the PR into the show itself and rather than just letting it be strictly organic. Now, I might be reading too much into it, but this was actually my experience. Like as he was introduced, I was like, "Oh, that's a bit much." I'm like, I don't know. It was like Ewoks, right? Like here's the marketing campaign. This is the toy we're going to sell you afterwards. I felt like they were preemptively kind of. I don't know if they're gonna make action figures literally, but like selling part of the brand. And it was like I was watching a commercial for Eddie while I was watching the character Eddie, and it was just a little too much for me.
My hot take is that I feel that way about seasons 2 through 4, in that Stranger Things, I think, had such a great reaction, and it's not that this is a terrible thing, but after that first season, everyone's so in love with the characters and so in love with this story that they had no choice. Marketing wise, and because film is a business, they had no choice but continue with the same kids and the upside down, which I think the upside down, that's kind of why I made that retcon comment, is because I kind of joke maybe the title should just be Stranger Thing, because it's just it's the upside down. It's not anthological as though there are different Stranger Things, which a show like Fargo has done a very good job with, where there are light connections between seasons. Not that they would have to do that, but
Or like Gravity
feels,
Falls, right? Gravity Falls is like that too, where it's like different weird things.
right. It kind of feels to me like its reach exceeded its grasp, and that the success of the first season was so immense that it almost became a parody of itself. Season 3 was absolutely a parody of itself, where it's referencing itself, and then finally season 4, while they definitely created higher stakes with the horror, they kind of were trying to go back to their roots. And while they did some really elegant explanations to kind of make it feel like, oh, it's all one big story, to me, the thing is so colossal now, and there's so many freaking characters and
And
all
they
of
have
their
to give
arcs.
all of the character arcs so
Yeah,
much attention, and
that
I
Stranger
don't
Things
care.
Stranger Things is the Mind Flayer. It's this big monster that's got too many arms, and it's just like, oh my gosh, what happened to the really pared down, low stakes, of there's something weird in the town. Now it's like the town is the gateway, it's fine. They have to do that. But I would have
I can't.
loved if Stranger Things was
Sorry.
some new story every season that's lightly tied to, almost more cosmic horror, that there doesn't have to be an explanation for the upside down. It's just a weird thing that occurs, and then the new thing is something else, but whatever. It's good. I still watch all of it, so I'm the sucker, I guess.
I mean, it's like, I can't tell you how much I don't care about Nancy Wheeler's relationships. I just cannot tell you how much I could not possibly care less than I do. And Jonathan Byers, again, like, I still
That's
don't
it,
understand why they
Jonathan.
cast a 40-year-old as a high school student. But like,
He
on the
is
other
weird.
hand, I
There's a
love
long and
Steve
storied
Harrington
tradition
with
of
a
that.
passion, right? I love Steve Harrington, and anything with him in it, I will love. And I know there's got to be somebody out there who feels the same way about Nancy. And if that's true, that's why we have the show that we have, and that's why I don't like fan service, even when I can see that it benefits me at part. It's like they're talking to so many different audiences,
Right. Yeah.
and it starts to degrade the show, even though I still love Stranger Things. But
and the first season worked even with that creepy scene that they've now retconned, because it was a subversion. It's something very tight that's like, this is a weird guy. Now Jonathan's just kind of a little bit of a stock character, to the point where we can't tolerate him anymore, because it's like, remember that really creepy thing he did, where that was what it was about before. It was a little bit pushing you. It's like, do we like this? Are we comfortable with this? This isn't to rag on Stranger Things. I enjoyed it, but there are problems with it that I think it's limped along with ever since maybe a too perfect first season.
Interesting.
See, I want to push back a little bit, because what you see, Barrett, especially, as sort of an ever-evolving sort of fan service slash self-referential thing, I see more as I understand it, the Duffer Brothers, the whole thing wasn't quite as tightly set up as something like Babylon 5, which to me is still like the cream of the crop of the, J. Michael Straczynski walks in and says, here's my 5-season arc, here's all the individual character arcs, here's how I could write them out if the actors die, or in the case of the main actor actually get schizophrenia and be unable to continue, right? He had this really interesting thing mapped out, and it works really, really well. And I think the Duffer Brothers had a vague sort of general outline that they're still following, but
Maybe
season to season it evolves in individual specific ways, in maybe the fan service way you're thinking of. But I see this more as interaction of, okay, here's where point A, where we start season 3, and we want to get to point B, and what do we put in the middle? And they kind of fill that in with stuff that they hadn't as tightly planned for, which may account for the differences between, I agree with you, the very tightly done season 1, and nothing else has been as quite tightly written as that. But I've enjoyed it, and I like that the stakes are raising, and I enjoy that we're getting into some more serious sort of world-defining stuff. To me, it feels very Harry Potter, where the first book, it's all kind of, wacky, and the staircases move, and there are ghosts and the whatever, and then by the time you get to book 5, like, people are dying. And as the story ages, it matures as well. And you're dealing with the Ministry of Magic and like propaganda and just there's all sorts of more adult themes, not in the sense of triple X or sexuality or whatever else, but just more mature themes there. That's a better term. And I'm enjoying that from Stranger Things, even if I agree with you also, Nathaniel, that they should have wrapped up the whole Nancy Wheeler relationship plot line probably in season 3, because that's an interesting plot line. But if they're gonna keep that going through the whole thing,
it doesn't work with increased stakes. Like,
no,
why
it
do I
doesn't.
care so much about some high school romance when we've moved on, folks?
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
There was a lot of romance in that ending 2-hour episode where we had to have at least 5 minutes of each of the couples, and there are like 4 of them, staring into each other's eyes dramatically as the world. And it's like, okay, move it along. Maybe we didn't need this episode to be 2 hours. Like, thank you. I appreciate this. But speaking of fan service, we are 45 minutes into a podcast with Mormons talking about Stranger Things, and we have yet to mention Susie, and I think we need to work on that. What do we think about episode 6? I watched episode 6 before I watched the rest, actually. I went and fast forwarded and watched the Susie scenes because I couldn't take it. I had to see it.
I made a meme out of that first scene where they open the door and there's the little kid with the bow and arrow, and I laughed so hard. I was waiting. How are they going to introduce this Mormon family? How are they going to do it? And that was the first scene, and I was like, nailed it. Perfect. We're done. This is representation. I feel seen. We're good. This is the first genuine presentation of Mormons I've seen in popular culture ever. That just like perfect. I was good. It was excellent.
You need to send us that meme. We'll put it in the show notes or something.
Yeah, I'll go look for it.
Yeah, but for me, I don't know if it's possible to laugh autobiographically. That is exactly what happened to me in those first 10 seconds when the door swings open and that kid's sitting there with this Indian outfit and he just screams and shoots the little rubber sucker bow and arrow and hits Mike in the head. I was like, or not, sorry, not Mike. Anyway, hits him in the head, and I was like, oh yes, that was my brother Stephen. And for those of you who know Stephen, he is a very, very serious person now, but he did not start out that way.
I loved it too because I grew up in a non-Mormon area, so I brought my non-Mormon friends to my house, and so seeing their reaction to the Mormon family, I was like, they got both sides. This was me bringing my friends into my house. Perfect. They'd be like, what is happening? And I'd be like, this is where we live.
I thought it was especially interesting with that happening kind of right at the same time as Under the Banner of Heaven and taking the same time period on. And while there was probably like to both of you guys' points, while there was some maybe minutia of things that were a little bit I don't know, a little bit off, I felt like Stranger Things really nailed the spirit of some of the, I don't know if stereotypes is the right word, but some of the kind of widely understood the spirit of like, yep, big Latter-day Saint family and some of the dynamics and things, while the, Susie being 16 and dating wasn't super taken into account. Season 3 did touch on the fact that she wasn't supposed to be dating, Dusty Buns, right? And and I actually paused and read that talk that that the dads were. It's a good talk. It's like that's a good little piece of a talk. I could copy that and see if anyone in Sacrament meeting, notices.
This is the talk that's on her dad's computer.
Yeah, her dad's writing.
In case people haven't seen the meme, look it up. It's a talk about eternal marriage. Quotes Gordon B. Hinckley. It's great.
Yeah, her dad confiscates the computer, and so in that sense, I thought this is a really fun, very appropriate kind of examination of big Mormon family in Salt Lake. In an ironic way that it seemed like, at the same time, Under the Banner of Heaven was leaning into stereotypes and things that were to some extent very backward or did not ring true with a larger group. So I just found that contrast kind of ironic and fascinating at the time.
Yeah, I have to agree. Like the contrast between the two was interesting because with Under the Banner of Heaven, there was, the LA Times writing this article about how they worked so hard on researching what kind of art would have been in Mormon households. And of course, Stranger Things is really sloppy with that. We get the burning Sacred Heart of Jesus picture in Susie's room, which no Mormon family would let their daughter have, like not going to happen. But even though Stranger Things gets these little details wrong, like the view of Salt Lake is very clearly not the Salt Lake Valley in the 80s. It feels really weird. Like, and Under the Banner of Heaven got those things right. They got like, the Alpine Tabernacles and so they got those physical details correct. But Stranger Things got the spirit correct.
To some extent, although I noticed things in Under the Banner of Heaven, like when at one there was one, and this is such a small thing, but it's like, was it as hard as the detective is walking in to the house? There's a little photo of Jesus, and it's John Foss as Jesus from the 2012 Bible videos, like right there. It's the one there, and it was little things like that were fine, but But
Yeah, yeah.
to your point, they're closer, but it's still like, man,
They're
you could do a
closer
little
in those
more.
things, but they didn't capture, like, it didn't feel like Jeb Pyrie could have been in the same ward as Susie's family. Like, they didn't feel like they're in the same universe in any way.
Good way to put it.
Um, so, and yeah, I
Yeah.
loved Susie 100%. I really connected with her family dynamics and the craziness of, like, I don't know if this is like intentional, if it's, but it felt like all the kids were doing very artistic and educational things, right? They're making films, they're doing like period sword fights, they're learning to cook. That that particular detail I think felt very Mormon, very
Mm.
LDS to me. Like, the kids are doing productive things at home and being encouraged to be creative, and in a time when maybe it's not as popular.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
don't feel like there's a lot of really positive depictions of large family dynamics. And I think just as you're talking about it now, I'm like, yeah, that's probably what made me feel so at home there. Like those kids were weird, um, but they were doing cool stuff. And it made the whole big, like, I think anybody would see that and be like, oh, big families could be cool. And so that love of a big family, I think, really gets to the heart of the spirit of kind of the Latter-day Saint experience. And it's so rare to see. And that's why I think it felt so familiar to me.
Mm.
Mm.
It seems like Stranger Things also has a little bit of a crush on Mormonism as a little go to, like escapes thing, because I think even in season 3 that Max lies to, or it was at season 2
Season
that
two.
Max lies to Billy, and says it's the Mormons outside, and I mean those kind of throwaway references are common, but they're so common in so many examples of media. But it's
Mm.
funny. There's been a development. The Latter Day Saint presence has grown a little bit with each of the past 3 seasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I felt like they had to throw in that rebellious older daughter because you can't have a positive depiction of Mormons without qualification, given the controversy
That's
around our
true.
religion and the fact that we're just not cool and people don't like us as a general rule. So all I'm looking for in a depiction of Latter-day Saints in art is be gentle with the qualifiers, pretty much, and get and get some stuff right. And I didn't mind the qualification. Like they got one rebellious daughter. It was a little bit over the top, a little bit of a stereotype, but whatever. Like it was fine. It didn't feel like nearly as much as the qualification as you'd see with like to go back to the Expanse, right? Where they have to insert a bunch of like, well, of course the Mormons are racist, and I'm like, really? Like that's the kind of qualification that just kind of hurts. It's like that's not
Yeah.
who we are, right?
Mhm.
And that's not about history, because if you want to go into our history, yeah, we got a lot to apologize for. I mean, obviously this is a whole other topic. I'm not trying to say anything should be whitewashed, but if you're depicting us today as we're trying to be, and especially if you're depicting us like a couple hundred years from now, like there's problems, but that shouldn't be one of them. Like that is we have bad history. Nobody should have to hide it. Like that's fine. But like if you're gonna do the qualifications, it should be sincere and genuine. And that didn't feel sincere and genuine. But Stranger
Right.
Things
There should be
did.
some
I was like,
speculation forward about where they would be now and how we would have changed it. And it's not. It's just,
and
let's
just come up
take
with a problem
the
with us
stereotypes
that's
that are in the Book of Mormon musical and put them in the Expanse.
yeah, and give it some
Yeah.
thought, right? Like anybody could come up with that. Like Google Mormons, like what's wrong with Mormonism? First search result, put that in. Like, okay, you didn't look into who we are at all. Like there's stuff wrong with our culture. There's stuff wrong with every culture, but like do a little bit of effort. Call up a Mormon friend. Like find something that's interesting or shows that you actually looked into it. And I just felt like Stranger Things did that a little bit more. So I didn't mind. I felt like, yeah, okay, there's the qualification. That's cool. That's fair.
Okay, one more thing I wanted to talk about before we get to our rating segment is kind of the Vecna controversy. A lot of people didn't like Vecna because the series before has not had like an embodied antagonist, right? It's always been kind of unintelligent evil forces that are just doing what they naturally do.
And
How do you
causing
guys
it.
feel about Vecna?
I loved him. I was glad that we now had a person or a thing that we can focus our attention on as the villain, as opposed to just this sort of villainous parallel dimension thing with lots of creepy weird monsters and stuff. Although we still don't know what the Upside Down is or where it came from, or like he ends up there because of his fight with 11.
But did she
But
create it by sending him there? It's not right. It's not
it's
clear for
not
sure.
clear yet, right? Like there are a couple unanswered questions about the Upside Down that I hope they answer in season 5, which they've announced will be the final season. But I thought that the actor absolutely nailed it. He nailed him as one.
Mm.
And then I ruined it for myself because I went and looked something up and I saw like his name playing 1/Vecna/ the name of
The boy.
his like the boy, and I was like, oh, that's
Oh
it. Like all
no!
like it was about 10 minutes before they do the full reveal of of who he is, where he came from, the whole thing, and I missed that. So
Dang.
don't go read Wikipedia when you're watching a show, guys. I don't know what I was expecting to
As we've
happen,
just
What were
but
you
said,
thinking?
yeah,
rookie mistake.
that was just dumb on my part. But I
Oh,
thought he was menacing. I thought the actor and the actress who plays 11 had some good chemistry together. Um, I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I feel like I didn't realize I was waiting for there to be an intelligence that was sort of operating behind the scenes to do all of these things. And I think the show is better for it. Not to mention the fact that, man, that guy Bowers is his name, I think. He I'm gonna go look him up now, but he just did an absolutely astoundingly cool job as the actor. And I just real quick, I like the sort of moral element to the fact that he is a problem in some ways that 11 created and now was going to have to deal with. And I sort of just like that sort of theme that you can create problems and there will be consequences to your actions that will resonate forward, that you have to deal with in the future. Just as a general theme and plot point is one that I enjoyed immensely. So I
I
like
agree
it.
with Carl a lot. I found 11 and Vecna's relationship to be one of the strongest points of the fourth season, and it's what made this fourth season much better for me. I mean, I've explained some of my my concerns or problems, but I really liked that relationship. It was just as Carl just stated, it was something we haven't seen um, very much of. And that twist, I didn't know about it. I hadn't seen anything, and I didn't see it coming at all. And so once it all came together, I was like, oh, that's really good. That's fun. And this dynamic and this character is very compelling and interesting. And then some of what was mentioned, how there's like these allusions to other horror films and other kind of classic 80s franchises. A lot of that is embodied in the Vecna version of his character, where that's not a huge thing for me, but I like that they're thinking that way. I think it's very cool that they're kind of nodding to older forms of art.
they're
I
aware
think,
of it, right?
yeah,
Instead of
Vecna's.
just accidentally doing the same thing. They're like, yes, we're doing the same thing on purpose.
Yes, to me, Vecna's the best thing to happen to Stranger Things in a while, and really kind of I think is going to bring it all together at the end.
Jamie
So,
Campbell Bower is the name of the actor, and he and Millie Bobby Brown, who play 11, like
Yeah, they did a good job.
Yeah.
they do great work together.
so I agree with everything you said, both of you, but I was actually really disappointed in two things. First of all, there was way too much explanation in this season, and it took too much of the mystery away. One of the things I like the most in stories is mystery, and it didn't get drawn out long enough. I wanted these answers to come in season 5, preferably the second half of season 5. For me, so much of the tension of wanting to watch this is trying to figure it out.
Hmm.
So getting it early was really disappointing, and then I just really don't like the idea of Vecna as the big bad. I was really sold by the otherness of of the Upside Down and of the Mind Flayer. I'm much more interested in an enemy that is hard to understand and that has motives that are weird. And Vecna seems like such an absolutely off the shelf generic sociopath bad guy that I'm just like, are you kidding me? Like, you could just call him stock villain 3. And for him to show up as like a character that brought focus to the season, I was on board with. And when they were first, Vecna must be the general of the Mind Flayer at the time he's in as general. I'm like, yes, cool. All right. This is he's a good mini boss, right? But if Vecna's really the end boss, I'm so disappointed. Um, just devastated almost. I'm like, really? This is the bad guy we're going to be fighting? Like, he's not
I have to
interesting.
agree with you about I don't know where season 5 is going to go because it feels like we're just all that's left is to have the final confrontation. And I don't know how to sustain a whole season on that. I was actually thinking that season 4 was going to be the end the whole time. And then, like, about halfway through the last episode, you're like, this isn't going to wrap up, is
No,
it?
because we have to have 3-episode plot arc of Nancy Wheeler trying to decide, what college to attend.
I think they painted themselves in
Welcome
a
to
corner,
season
though.
5.
That's one
Yeah.
of the reasons I liked Vecna. Is to Nathaniel's point. I mean, I missed the Lovecraftian version of the Upside Down from season 1. Now it is something else. But to me, I don't know. I guess as a storyteller, to me, I and maybe I'm just not thinking creatively enough, but I feel like they painted themselves into a corner where Vecna is the only solution. Like, and maybe you're right. Like, we don't know who he is until the very end, and that would have been a better way to maintain the tension. But it's like, I think that this far into it, they have to come up with an explanation. And so that's why I like Vecna, is I think it's the best explanation versus letting it be this mystery that they left behind somewhere. If you're going to drag it out this far, then
Me
you
and my
have
daughter
to
have come up with better explanations for like the Upside Down and what was behind this and why time stopped. Like, I like our in-house family theories way better than what they
rewrite
See,
it.
this is interesting to me because because we still have this unanswered question about what the Upside Down is. I think there still are some Lovecraftian elements. Like, it shows in the flashbacks while Henry Creel is
Yeah.
there in the Upside Down.
Yep.
He runs into the Mind Flayer. Like, that's a separate entity from him. And is it corrupting him? Is he controlling it? It's a little unclear exactly like what the relationship of him to the Upside Down is. And so I think if it turns out in season 5 that all of your fears, Nathaniel, are realized, I will end up agreeing with you. But for now, I hold out hope, again, knowing that the Duffer Brothers had this sort of arc of the whole series in mind from the beginning, and this one unanswered question of what the Upside Down is. I hold out hope that there's going to be something a little bit more, even though I agree with your stock bad guy character 3 assessment. I always thought, oh, another little kid just like Voldemort who was creepy in the orphanage when Dumbledore met him for the first time. Like, it would be interesting to see, and there's got to be one out there, but I keep not running into it, where you watch the bad guys fall from grace, and to become a real good villain. But again, Voldemort was always creepy.
Darth
This
Vader?
kid,
Or
well,
Breaking
okay.
Bad. Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad. Thank you. Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Or
Breaking
okay.
Bad
most
is one for
shows
that.
that are good.
Well,
I'm
and
sorry, I
Carl-
love Stranger Things. I just really
Carl,
have
I
a
will
problem
also
with Vecna.
say, like, I found Kid Vecna way less interesting than 001 Vecna.
Yeah, I liked 1.
With
I liked 1
11.
too. Yeah. Like, and
Well,
everything you guys said about the relationship between
Yeah.
1 and 11. Oh, it was
But his
really good.
motivation of like, I like spiders because they kill. You know what I mean? I agree with you there.
Like,
It's not.
Yeah.
It's not
And
super.
Carl, to what you're saying, to me, it felt very clear that whatever the Upside Down is, it's just some other alternate dimension, and it doesn't really matter because everything that's happened has been Vecna imposing his will. If I'm wrong about that, then I will be overjoyed. And so I really hope I am, and there's an explanation that is different. But to me, the fact that it's like, oh, there's the Mind Flayer, but Vecna's the boss, that kind of neuters the whole question. Who cares what the history of the Upside Down is if everything that has happened has been the result of Vecna showing up and then twisting it to his will? So it doesn't matter what it was before. It doesn't matter where it came from. Its only function in the show for all the seasons that we've seen so far, if I'm right, and it seemed really clear to me at the end, is it's a tool of Vecna. So now I don't care about the mystery anymore.
We will find out in season
find
5, I
out.
suppose.
I hope I'm wrong.
The
I
other
really
thing
hope I'm
I
wrong.
wanted to talk about is talking about Eddie. We talked about him a little bit. I really liked Eddie's character arc, in that he seems like he's going to be a bad influence at the beginning, and then we find out he's really just naive and afraid and trying to stay away from pain. And then we see him grow into someone who will stand up for others and protect others from pain. So I kind of like that it subverted the idea that the drug dealer is this big bad influence guy, and we find out he's just running from pain like everyone else, and he finally makes his way out of that as well. He's redeemed. So I
This
enjoy
is music.
it.
I actually thought he would be more problematic and have more of a redemption. It seemed like he was just kind of mean, and then he turns out he's just a really great guy, or just really nice and loves the kids. I would have liked to see, frankly, more of what they did with Jonathan Byers from the first season, where it actually has stakes, and the show's willing to make you uncomfortable and make you think, well, these characters are multifaceted. I mean, what Jonathan did wasn't right, but yet there was this change of relationship. I thought we'd see more of that with Eddie, and frankly, I thought we did get a little bit of that with Billy. Where it's like Billy sucks. Billy's like
Billy was
kind of
the
evil,
worst.
but he has some good sides too, and they come through. And so I like when the show does that. It kind of subverts your assumptions about people.
Yeah. And to me, Eddie always felt to me like he was going to be the weird outcast, since the Dungeons and Dragons kids, who we all know are cool and fun, like because they like him, I always kind of knew he was going to turn out to be not any kind of bad guy or anything, that he was just going to be a very misunderstood ugly duckling sort of figure. And that turned out to be right, and I really enjoyed him, and I also just absolutely loved the most metal concert in the history of the world, because that was just so awesome.
Was fantastic. It really was. I mean, you could call it fan service, but it was exactly what we wanted, and it was a stand up and cheer moment to cheer for.
Yes.
The other character who really stole the show was Max. I've always loved Max, but I felt like her storyline, her plot arc is also a really good representation of. I have a couple of friends who struggle with suicidal thoughts, and I've always found it really, really hard to empathize with that, because that is just it's just not a mindset that I comprehend in any way. And so, I still try to be a good friend and recognize that that's something that's real to them. But I felt like Max really made me understand what that is like, to believe that the world would be a better place without you, or to believe that it would be an end to your pain. So I felt like her character arc is a very good lesson in empathy for those who are really suffering and have been through hard things. And nobody else understands, because Billy was kind of a trash person, and she told him that, but she also loved him. So
I love
her
Max.
her
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Amen.
her conversation with Lucas at the end is the one couple that we could have
Oh,
spent
yeah.
time with in that episode.
right,
You're right about the rest of them. We can take it or leave it, but
yeah,
their coming back together was, I think, a profoundly moving moment, to see her friends there helping and support her, even the ones that she had pushed away. It was a
It
great
felt
character
earned.
arc.
It did.
Yes,
It
it felt
felt
earned.
earned. And
Yeah.
that running up that hill scene and greater episode that everybody loved, I think was deserved for the the excitement and the acclaim it got. I think that's why. I mean, my opinion is that's why that song got so big, is really thanks to the scene, thanks to the writing. That was one of
yeah.
the stronger
Yeah.
episodes in the season, and if there had been more of kind of that treatment, I think that season 4 would have been stronger. I don't think it's horribly weak, but those pieces are the best to me for sure. The Max thing, that really hit me. I mean, her running and the music and everything, it was to your point, Liz, such a visual metaphor of things that are hard to articulate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so
I just agree with
now
that
on
all.
to the ratings. For content wise, where would you guys put this? It is more horror than the previous few seasons, and even if it's similar in creepiness to season 1, I feel like there's more of that body horror and violence that's a little bit more
Yeah.
even.
So the way we do it here is the celestial, terrestrial, telestial, outer darkness. I definitely think this falls into the telestial category, like the people being hung in the air, crucified for a little bit, and then having their bones all smashed together and they got thrown on the
Yeah.
ground like rag dolls. Like this is terrible. Like I if I were rating this as a movie, I think all these things, and then their eyes implode too in their moment of death. It's rated R. It would be rated R, and whatever benefits and good things we get out of the show, obviously we all seem to generally have enjoyed it. Whatever else, content wise, it's not Outer Darkness because I reserve that for things like Under the Banner of Heaven and depictions of temple ceremonies and stuff. But it's I put it in the Telestial category.
Ditto.
It's interesting that stuff that you just mentioned is what enhanced it in my eyes and made it more like, I think it's inextricable from the stakes of the show that it seemed more serious and like it was getting more real. It's funny because I would put Under the Banner of Heaven in Outer Darkness, or maybe even Brigham Young's Annihilation category. You know,
We're
nothing
gonna
left.
resurrect that doctrine just for you.
I'd put Stranger Things either in terrestrial or even celestial because of those elements. It's like finally a little bit. It's going back to its roots and it's taking itself a little bit more seriously. So I don't know if celestial only because of well, no, if it's
But yeah,
artistic
this one's
merit,
more about the content and
yeah,
about that we need to worry about it with people. And I know a lot of people who enjoyed the first 3 seasons who felt like they couldn't watch season 4. And I
yeah,
definitely did not watch those scenes personally.
it is so hard for me, and I've written ad nauseum about this uh, to kind of separate the content from the context.
Yeah.
And so for me, yeah, content, I will stick by my terrestrial celestial because of how it's used, and that I think it's creative and I think it's powerful and it's got higher stakes because of it. It for me, and all due respect, because I completely
No,
appreciate
absolutely.
your
We
views.
like disagreement on our ratings
Yeah.
so that people can see a variety of opinions and know that
to
it's okay.
me to rate something's value or to diminish its value because of how adult or graphic it is a little too reductionist. And so for me, I'd say the content is not for children, but it's and maybe that's problematic if it's being marketed to younger audiences, but I think that the content actually was better than the low stakes, sometimes slow motion, like deaths, versus like Barb got. I mean, that was horrifying. So yeah, it's hard to answer, but I'm going to put it in either maybe between celestial, terrestrial. Maybe it's progressing from terrestrial to celestial, and it'll get there one
There you
day.
go. Okay, so in terms of artistic merit, we give it a rating on a scale of 1 to 5 popcorn balls. How do you guys feel about that? I don't know where to put it. I don't think it's by any means a great masterpiece.
3.5 for me, maybe.
Sorry,
That's
what was
exactly
that?
Can I cut cotton ball or popcorn balls? Can I cut them in half?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd say probably around a 3.5. I think it close, not quite a 4, but yeah, 3.5 for me.
That's exactly what I had in my notes ahead of time. Yeah, 3.5.
Oh yeah.
I would give it a 3 just because of I didn't like the fact that everybody was split up. I still have no understanding of why
pacing was really slow.
Yeah, the pacing just seemed off this season. I still have no idea why the Byers family needed to move to California. That just seems unnecessary.
And the
just to
whole
set up the
Russia
cool
rescue
road trip.
plot line is protractedly long.
Yeah.
It's weird that that's also the comedy plot line. I'm still wondering about that. Like, how is breaking out of a communist prison the comedy plot line? But okay.
Right.
I guess it is.
So it just felt like there were some things that weren't quite balanced right, even though on the whole I liked it. So I'd give it 3.
Okay, 3 is reasonable. And then finally, gospel connections, as in what can you derive morally edifying messages from it? Do you feel like it is something that makes you think about important things? Scale of 1 to 5 apricots. I think there are definitely some character arcs that make you think a lot. There are other parts that are definitely just entertainment for me.
Well, to my point about the intense content, I think some of that's wasted. And Max was very excellent and well done, but I think some of the other characters, and of course we don't have much time with them, but some of the how he's selecting his killing through it being somebody who's weak or vulnerable or whatever, I thought a little bit of that was wasted. I think it could have said more with whatever it was trying to say. So I'd probably put it at about a maybe 2.5 or a 3 there as well. There's stuff that made you think. To our discussion on Latter-day Saint portrayals, maybe in that sense, it's edifying, not because it's about Latter-day Saints, but rather because we understand the generous and sort of empathetic way that it approached our community. But yeah, I felt, maybe it's that I felt like I could have learned more, or I wanted to be taught more, about friends. But then there's also those little moments like that was beautiful with Will and watching what Will's going through with his friends, and maybe even struggling with some of his own attraction to his friends and whatnot. So yeah, I'd probably landed at a 3 in that way.
I'm probably about a 3 as well. And I just have to call it the one person we haven't talked about in this entire episode, the unnamed guy who defends the kids when they get raided, who's just this kind of slightly overweight FBI agent looking guy who turns into an action hero for a few minutes. There's something really awesome about that lesson. I just love the this random unnamed character. I've been trying to figure out what his name is. I don't even know if he's named in the show, and he stole that episode and is awesome. And I just wanted to, I don't know, that self-sacrifice and the anonymous character. That was actually a powerful message to me. I really liked him.
Yeah.
I think I'd give it either a 2 or a 3, because I think some of these themes are there, like in the case of Max and PTSD and suicidal thoughts and all these things. They did a really good job. But I felt like a lot of the other gospel connections you would have to try to pull them out a little bit more, which is fine. I don't know if it's necessarily the point of a show like Stranger Things, but I think I'm going to land on 2 overall, with the idea that Max's subplot is like a 4 or a 5.
Yeah,
Good point.
that's
Great way
true.
of putting
That's
it.
definitely true. One of the plots that was really disappointing to me was Elle's plot, actually. Like, it's so generic bullying that has almost no flavor of its own, that it feels like we almost don't care about it. So there's definitely, it could have been, they could have done something more interesting with Elle's struggle to integrate herself into a regular school as a regular person without powers. So yeah, I'm going to agree with you all 2 on that.
And then even her rediscovering her powers, and the whole, they were using her as the vehicle for the big reveal that one is Vecna, is the other kid, right? So
yeah. And so
really
the
Bobby
past
Brown
plot
was
line of
really,
her is really cool, and then
I did like that it taught
present day one
you,
is not.
you can't always trust who's nice to you, and that was kind of interesting, and that
sure.
he was deceiving her.
Yes, that was definitely interesting.
Not not anything particularly, I suppose, highly original in that case, but it was effective. I wasn't sure what to think about him and Papa and all of that.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So Barrett, where can people find your stuff online if they want to look you up?
That's a great question. So my website is burgundy.com. Bergen, like my last name, Burgin, and then die, like D-I-E. It's a play on, Berg indie films. So burgundy.com, you can see kind of just it's a little portfolio of my film work, and that website I'm building currently and going to be adding more to it. And then, or you can follow me on Instagram at Barrett Bergen, or look up Barrett Bergen on Facebook and add me. I add everybody on Facebook and stay well connected there. Or you can follow me on Twitter, which I'm very bad at keeping active, and so that's probably the worst way to see what's happening in my life. But yeah, the best thing you could do is either go to burgundy.com or even my Vimeo page, which is Burgundy, that has some of my short films and things that I'm working on coming up.
And your current film Cryo is available on Amazon Prime as well, right?
It's available on Prime. It's available. Well, I mean, you have to rent it, but yes. Rent or download on Amazon Video, iTunes, Apple TV, Voodoo, Google Play, YouTube to
So
buy.
look that one up as well if
Uh-huh.
you are interested to see more of Barrett's work. Nathaniel, where can people find you?
I'm on Twitter at Nathaniel Givens and also nathanielgivens.com. And from there, I think you can find most of what I've been working on.
Okay, Carl, where should we send people? Still Facebook?
No, I'm on Twitter now. I'm at Carl Cranny. Like Nathaniel, just my name is my Twitter handle. And so that's where people can find me and hang out.
All right, and you can follow my writing on my website, lizbusby.com, and there's links to my socials on there. Thanks for joining us this week. Next time, we'll be discussing The Atom Project, a 2022 Netflix movie about a man who travels back in time to save his wife and ends up teaming up with his younger self. So be ready for that discussion in a few weeks. This has been Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, encouraging you to seek after everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, or praiseworthy. See you next time.